What the Hoover Dam represents wasn't built in the years it took to pour the concrete. It was built in the decades before anyone arrived at Black Canyon, in the arguments over who owned the water, in the surveys that mapped a river most people would never see, in the legal frameworks that decided how much of nature could be divided and who would benefit when it was. The dam itself, its construction, its turbines, its Art Deco intake towers, that was the conclusion of a process that began long before the first dynamite charge was set. By the time work started in 1931, the Hoover Colorado River Compact had already been signed. The water had already been allocated. The political structure was already in place. What remained was execution. And execution, in this case, meant mobilizing a scale of labor and engineering that had rarely been attempted. Thousands of workers, millions of tons of material, a timeline that couldn't afford delay because delay meant political risk, funding risk, the collapse of a carefully assembled coalition. Most people remember the dam as a Depression-era employment project. That's not incorrect, but it simplifies what was actually happening. The workers who arrived weren't there because the government wanted to ease unemployment. They were there because a specific vision of the American West required the Colorado River to stop behaving like a river. It needed to become a reservoir, a predictable resource, something that could be scheduled.
And so, Black Canyon became a construction zone that operated around the clock. Men worked in heat that exceeded 120 degrees. They lived in a company town built for the sole purpose of keeping them on site. The work was dangerous. The conditions were brutal. But the project didn't stop. Because stopping would have meant admitting that the vision was flawed, that the engineering might not be worth the cost, that perhaps the river didn't need to be controlled in the first place. That conversation didn't happen. Instead, the dam rose. Concrete was poured in blocks with cooling pipes embedded inside to prevent cracking. The river was diverted through tunnels blasted into the canyon walls. And slowly, over 5 years, one of the largest structures ever built began to take shape. It was celebrated as a triumph, and in many ways it was. The engineering was extraordinary. The coordination was unprecedented. The finished dam became a symbol of what was possible when ambition met industrial capacity. But the triumph was also a displacement. Upstream, the reservoir began to fill. Towns were submerged. Canyons were drowned. Ecosystems that had existed for millennia were erased in a matter of years. The river that had carved the Grand Canyon was now a managed system, its flow determined by human need rather than natural cycle. Downstream, the effects were different but no less profound. The river no longer flooded. The silt that had nourished the delta for thousands of years stopped arriving. The Colorado River, which once reached the Gulf of California, began to disappear before it got there.
This wasn't discussed as a loss. It was framed as control, as progress, as the necessary cost of civilization. And for decades, that framing held. The dam generated electricity. It supplied water to Los Angeles, to Phoenix, to the farmland of the Imperial Valley. It worked in the sense that it did what it was designed to do. But what it was designed to do was based on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. The Colorado River Compact, signed in 1922, allocated water based on flow measurements taken during an unusually wet period. The amount of water promised to the 7 states that shared the river exceeded the amount the river actually carried in most years. This wasn't unknown. Hydrologists had warned that the data was insufficient, but the political pressure to move forward was stronger than the scientific caution. And so the compact was signed, and the dam was built, and the system was locked into place. By the time the miscalculation became undeniable, it was too late to redesign the infrastructure. The cities had grown, the farms had expanded, the economy of the Southwest had become dependent on a water supply that didn't exist in the quantities it had been promised. Most people never noticed this at the time. The crisis unfolded slowly. Lake Mead, the reservoir behind the Hoover Dam, began to drop. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. Year after year, the water level fell. The white ring of mineral deposits on the canyon walls grew wider. Intake structures that had been submerged for decades began to emerge. And still, the system continued, because the system had no mechanism for stopping. The water rights had been allocated, the contracts had been signed, the infrastructure had been built. Admitting that the foundation was flawed would require renegotiating agreements that involved states, cities, tribes, and nations. So instead, the problem was managed. Rationing plans were introduced, conservation measures were implemented, new pipelines were proposed. The conversation shifted from whether the system was sustainable to how long it could be prolonged. This is where the Hoover Dam stops being a story about construction and becomes a story about commitment. Because the dam itself still functions. The concrete hasn't failed, the turbines still spin, the structure is sound. What's failing is the premise. The idea that a river can be controlled indefinitely, that nature can be engineered into compliance, that the assumptions made in 1922 would hold for a century. They didn't. And now, 100 years later, the region faces a question it didn't ask in 1931. What happens when the infrastructure works, but the system it was built to serve doesn't? The Hoover Dam didn't take a century to complete because the construction was slow. It took a century to complete because what it set in motion, the legal agreements, the population growth, the economic dependency, took that long to reveal its full scope. The real consequence of the dam wasn't the reservoir. It was the commitment, the decision to build a society around a resource that was never as abundant as it was assumed to be. By the time that became clear, entire cities had been built in deserts. Millions of people had moved to places that couldn't sustain them without the river. And the river, despite everything, was still just a river, subject to drought, subject to climate, subject to limits that no amount of concrete could override. The workers who built the dam believed they were building permanence, and in a way, they were. The structure will likely stand for centuries. But permanence in infrastructure doesn't mean permanence in function. A dam can outlast the water it was built to hold. That's the part that wasn't planned for. When the Hoover Dam was dedicated in 1935, it was described as a monument to human ingenuity, and it is. But it's also a monument to the assumption that ingenuity could replace restraint, that engineering could substitute for limits. For a long time, that assumption seemed to hold. The light stayed on, the water kept flowing, the cities kept growing. But assumptions don't collapse all at once. They erode, slowly, until one day the gap between what was promised and what's possible becomes too wide to ignore. The Hoover Dam is still there. It's still functional. It still generates power and stores water. But the system it anchors is running on a deficit that compounds every year. And the question now isn't whether the dam will fail, it's whether the society built around it can adapt to a reality that was always there, beneath the surface. A century ago, the solution to the Colorado River was control. The legacy of that solution is still unfolding. And this wasn't the only river.